know that sin is not something we can dogmatically draw along the lines of a political party or a religious perspective, but within the human hearts. And I think in the life of Jesus, on this question of the way that this more nuanced anthropology about the good and evil within each of us shows itself, I think, is the story of the woman who's caught in adultery. And we find this in John's gospel, and I just want to read it to you. Here's what John writes. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees, these religious leaders again, they bring a woman who had been caught in adultery to Jesus. And placing her in the midst, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." Now, I think in those last words of Jesus we see, this is not Jesus saying he doesn't have any moral standards. This is not a relativism of the 21st century. He says, go and sin no more. Jesus has moral views. He holds this woman to them. But at the same time, I think that we see that there is something different, that the way that Jesus related to this woman, there's something different compared to the religious leaders around him. And I think the key to this passage lies in what he was writing on the ground. Now, scholars have just spilled buckets of ink trying to think about what this means. What is he writing on the ground? What does that even mean? Why is Jesus playing in the dirt? But what they think is probably happening here is maybe Jesus is kneeling down in the dust and writing down in the dirt the sins that each person there, perhaps even by name, had committed that very day. The older ones leave first, we read. I think what we find here again is not a Jesus who doesn't have moral standards. I think this is someone who has such high and holistic moral standards that it recasts how everyone in that community saw themselves in relation to a person who they saw as an outcast. You see, just as I think a sense of human dignity humanizes the person across the table, so also I think a nuanced anthropology of sin humanizes ourselves. When we see actually, though we're not setting aside the question of there being moral standards and boundaries, what we're able to acknowledge is a more nuanced understanding that actually, as Solzhenitsyn said, there is good and evil within us. There is sacredness because we're made in the image of God, and yet there is something that is not quite right. And it fosters a value of humility, not in a sense of thinking low of ourselves, but a sense of thinking real about ourselves. I just want to add, I was chatting with someone the other day at a university in the States who found out that we were putting on events like this and thinking about questions that both matter on the level of our culture and society, but also questions that relate to God. And he said to me, are you a Christian? I said, yes, I am. He said, do you believe you're not one of those people who believes in sin, right? And I was like, oh, okay, where's this going? I said, I do. And he said to me, he was actually a religion professor. He said to me, I teach Buddhism, and this idea of sin in Christianity bothers me so much. He says, why do you just go around making people feel bad about themselves? What kind of positive, uplifting message is that? And it made me think about, there's a colleague in our ministry who talks about how often we have a sense in our culture that true love is love in the absence of judgment. That's what true love is. You don't judge them. But he raises the question, is that really the case? Even if we said on the level of human relationships, true love is love in the absence of judgment. And he says, imagine that someone you don't really know, maybe you've met this person, you like them a lot, you've gone on a few dates, but they really don't know you, and they say they love you. Oh, they've raised it. They've said the L word, I love you. They don't really know you yet. there's a sense in which it will be nice, but a little shallow. Because you can always wonder, okay, if this person really knew who I was, would they really love me? And in one sense, he puts it this way, he says, to be fully loved, but not fully known is superficial. There'll always be a sense in which you can always wonder, if this person really knew me, would that love still be there? But he says at the same time, to be fully known and not loved is our deepest fear. To have someone look at us into the depths of our heart and to see who we really are and then to be rejected for that, that'd be the worst. But to be fully known and fully loved, to be seen as who we are and yet to be chosen, I love you, knowing who you are, that is our heart's deepest desire. And I think what that does when you think about the issue of sin or even the message of the cross, here you have this larger picture of the scene with Jesus and the woman. Jesus, who Christians believe was this one who had the full right to judge because he really didn't have any sin. He forgives this woman. And Christians believe that's through the cross. And this idea of the cross is looking at it, you see an offensive message. You're so sinful, the Son of God had to die for you. But you're so loved and you're so known that you're known to the depths of who you are and you're loved all the same. To be fully known and fully loved, I think, is our heart's deepest desire. Just as I think a sociology that fosters human dignity humanizes the other, I think so also an anthropology with a more nuanced view of our human hearts humanizes ourselves. And I want to end with this last concept of ontology. And that comes from the Greek word ontos, which is related to the word for being. And it has to do with the question of identity and how, even on an existential level, how do we see ourselves as individuals? What is Logan? Who am I deep down at the most fundamental level? Am I a machine? Am I a soul? Am I what my friends think I am? Who are we? And I want to read you a quote from a Pulitzer Prize-winning author named Ernest Becker, who, reflecting on just in general, the West's shift away from a theological view of the world that involved a God, how that's shaping the way we view ourselves. And here's what he says. Modern man edged himself into an impossible situation. We still need to feel heroic. We need to feel our life matters in the grand scheme of things. We want to merge ourselves with some higher self-absorbing meaning and trust and gratitude. But if you don't have God, how do you do this? I think what he's drawing on is there is a sense in which we want to be part of a larger story. We're all seeking transcendence. And he coins this term called apocalyptic romance as one way in which we find, if I could just find that person or that experience or that moment, then I could have my identity rooted in something that transcends beyond the world around me. But he says, he alludes in this book to ways that we can do this politically, we can do this around a culture, we can do this around a sexual identity. He says, essentially, we are all looking for identity. We're wired that way. But without a theological dimension, we find ourselves finding our identity in things around us. And I want to quote here Michel Foucault, who's a French thinker, existentialist, certainly not a Christian by any means, when he reflects on what happens when we find our identity without a theological framework. He says, when we find our identity, we're deciding where we get our sense of worth. But the result of that is that we begin to despise those who don't have it. And he gives, as an example, he'd say, if you find your identity in being a hard worker, if you will value, I've built my career, I've built my family, built my home, Foucault is saying you will start to look down on those who you see as lazy. He says you'll begin to despise them eventually. If you build your sense of identity being a moral or a religious person, you will start to despise those who you see as non-religious or immoral. If you see yourself as being a liberal person who's accepting of everybody, you'll start to despise people you see as intolerant or bigots. What Foucault is saying is that naturally when we define our identity around something, the corollary on the other side is we will naturally look down on those who don't share what we have found our worth and identity in. We've made something transcendental that is not just an opinion anymore, not an accessory in my life, but it's who I really am. And what that means is that if you don't agree with me, we begin to hear the echoes of what Michael Ramsden was saying, that this is not just an issue of preference, it's an issue of ontology, of being. This is who I am. And there's an inclination perhaps to look down on those who see that differently. And I want to, in this last section, I want to propose that I think on the question of identity, the Christian faith, again, offers a different framework and phrases the question of identity in a wholly different way. And I want to just share, by way of looking at this, one of the most famous stories of Jesus telling the parable of the prodigal son. And for Christians, this story captures so much of the basic questions of who are we as humans, what is God like, how do we relate to him, and does it even matter? So I just want to read this story from Luke's gospel here. Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me a share of the property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them." Now, just pause here. What's interesting about this story is we call it the story of the prodigal son. But for the Middle Eastern listener of the first century, the focus of the story would be on the father, because the father reacts in ways that are utterly paradigm-breaking for this civilization. For instance, this situation here, the son has approached the father and asked for his inheritance. This would have been the utter disgrace to ask a father, because it would mean that you're essentially saying, "I wish that you were dead. There is money I know is coming to me. I want you to give it to me now. I can't stand to be alive in your presence enough for you to die. I would like to run away as far as I can from you." It's just, if this happened, the father in this Middle Eastern conservative culture would have shamed the son publicly. He might have disowned him in front of the rest of the community. This is not what this father does. The father divided his property between them. He gives him what he wants. For the first century Middle Easterner, shocking. We continue. "Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country where he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens in that country, who sent him in the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything." For a Jew raised in a Jewish religious family, this man is now feeding pigs. This is the lowest of the low. It's hyperbolic to the point of almost being humorous of how low this man had sunk in this culture. He's isolated from his family. He's isolated, he's physically isolated, he's on his own, doesn't have food. He's hungry. And here's what we read next. "But he came to himself and he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.'" Now, many people, even within Christian circles, will say about this scene, here is the scene of repentance. Here is the scene where the younger son has felt remorse about what he's done. He realizes the shame he's brought on his father, and he's now turning his life around. He's decided, I'm going to go back. I'm going to make it right with my father. I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to be part of the family again. But if you look at the text, that is not what Jesus is saying. There is no sense of remorse. There is no sense of guilt. There is nothing in this scene at all except hunger. He's thinking about his stomach. He's saying, I'm hungry. The servants in my father's house were never hungry. I know what I'll do. I'll get my dad to hire me as a servant. And we see all of a sudden that what he's doing is the same thing that he did when he left. He was using the father's resources for his own good. Now he's going to use the father's resources again. It's not a remorse scene here. That doesn't quite come yet. And so we keep reading. He arose and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf, and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He is lost, and is found. And they began to celebrate. For the Middle Eastern listener, again, it's the father that's the focus of attention. The community would have known what the son had done and the shame that he had brought on the father. There are some commentators who say it's perhaps the case that the community would have been expected when they saw the son coming in the distance, that they would go out and pick up stones around the village and keep the son from coming home and bringing further disgrace on the father. It was certainly not expected the father would go. This would be a service that the rest of the community would offer on his behalf, that the son would bear the weight of the shame of the wrong that he'd done, and he would be driven out even as he tried to come home. And yet, in this story, the father runs to the son and embraces him. He puts on a ring on his finger, the symbol of status again in the family. He puts on shoes, the symbol of a free man and not a hired servant. He puts on, he kills the fattened calf, the prize of the family. He gives him the Lamborghini. And in the West today, we look at this as a wonderful story of reconciliation. It's heartwarming. Oh, the father loved the son. But sometimes the question can be raised, Christians speak about how God, when he forgave us, that had happened through his son dying on the cross. And yet it seems here that Jesus forgives, the Father forgives. We know that there's a parallel going on here. The Father is forgiving, but without any cost or why does Jesus need to die for us to be forgiven? But what's significant about this scene is that just as we've seen that the son would have been bearing the weight of the shame of the community around him, perhaps even the stones they would throw at him, so we see that the father is actually taking on some shame himself. In this culture, patriarchs didn't run. Children ran. Maybe women ran. Patriarchs didn't run. You'd have to pick up the skirts of your robes and run. You'd show your legs to the community. It was shameful. In a sense, we begin to see what's going on here. The father, you can imagine, the villagers, their eyes are pointed out, they're looking at the son, and then all of a sudden comes the running father. The shame of the son has been taken on the father. And what we find in this embrace is the exchange that Christians believe has happened in the cross. That God on the cross is bearing our shame and our guilt, that we might be welcomed back into the family of God, with all that entails, a status in his family, freedom in his family, and the joys that come with a party, with a community of loving people. But what's powerful about this for what we're talking about tonight is where the son had his moment of change. We've looked at, I don't think it happens in the pig pen. He's just following his stomach there. There's no remorse. The change happens, we get the clue of it in his words to the father when he's muffled in his father's arms. Instead of the speech about becoming a servant, that last part is left out. And we begin to see that the son realized that deep down, the biggest problem wasn't the hunger in his stomach, but the relationship that was once broken with that father. We're speaking tonight about how do you get along with those who are deeply different from you, and what resources does the Christian faith have to offer? Paul writes, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And the profundity of this is this. If you're a secular person, your tendency naturally is to say, I will think of you as an enlightened person if you believe as I believe, perhaps that all religions lead to God, if there is a God, and if you behave as I behave. In other words, if you champion the causes that I believe in. If you're a religious person, you might say, I will consider you a good person if you believe the religious doctrines that I believe, and if you behave in the way that I expect you to behave. But in the message of the cross, in the embrace of the Father, we see love that is extended before the Son believes the right thing and before he starts behaving in the right way. And what that means for us today is it gives you a framework in which to approach someone who is not believing the right thing and not behaving the right way, and yet to love them. To the extent that you realize that the way that God has related to you is to meet you actually in those conditions when you weren't believing the right thing and you weren't behaving the right way, and yet has loved you then, so also, to the extent that that touches your hearts, will it give you a framework to approach people in the same way? To love them enough to listen, to see the humanity in them, to be aware of your own shortcomings, to love them enough to seek their good, even if there is enmity and hatred. And I just want to close with just a few thoughts from where I think we have gone through another time of turmoil and emerged from it. I think in the 1950s and 60s in the civil rights movement, what we saw was a division. And I think when you look at the champions of that movement, did they ever have a just cause? Martin Luther King, Their cause was right, and they faced great injustice. And yet, when you think about the polarization in that culture in that time, you had the Black Panthers on one side and a robust black nationalism against the outright white supremacy on the other side. You had Martin Luther King Jr. step in the middle and receive criticism from the Black Panthers. You're a pushover. He has a doctrine of nonviolence. And yet, certainly was ridiculed from the other side as well. Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a civil activist, he was also a pastor. And he justified this nonviolent approach by saying, through nonviolent resistance, we shall be able to oppose the unjust system and at the same time love the perpetrators of that system. Coming from the States, I have to acknowledge that we have not solved our issues in the area of race. But I do think that something tremendous did happen in those years. But I don't think it was primarily through a new education framework of understanding differences in race and culture and that sort of thing. That's not what changed a nation. I think it could be reduced down even to images. It was seeing images like African Americans wearing signs that say, "I am a man," and having police dogs let loose on them. It's seeing images like the peaceful marches at Selma and fire hoses being sprayed and police officers beating down people who just were walking peacefully. And I know you think also of these images of people doing sit-ins in white-only cafes and having drinks poured over their heads as they refuse to respond in anger. And it was images like that changed the conscience of a country. And what King is saying is that here you have a framework in the Christian faith to have, even though you have a just cause, and even though you're the recipient of injustice, a framework in which to love someone while they're still not believing what you believe and behaving the way you'd like to behave. And I just want to read this quote to him that he wrote actually in a sermon that he preached on his own reflections on his life. He said, "Due to my involvement in the struggle for the freedom of my people, I have known very few quiet days in the last few years. I have been imprisoned in Alabama and Georgia 12 times. My home has been bombed twice. A day seldom passes that my family and I are not the recipients of threats and death. I have been the victim of a near-fatal stabbing. So in a real sense, I have been battered by the storms of persecution. And I must admit that at times I have felt I could no longer bear such a heavy burden and have been tempted to retreat to a more quiet and serene life. But every time such a temptation appeared, something came to strengthen and sustain my determination. I have learned now that the Master's burden is light precisely when we take his yoke upon us. As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways to respond to my situation, either to react with bitterness or to seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course. There are some who still find the cross a stumbling block. Others consider it foolishness. But I am more convinced than ever before that it is the power of God unto individual and social salvation. So like the Apostle Paul, I can now humbly yet proudly say, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus." I think the question raised by a life like King's is, do each of us have a framework like that? A way of seeing the world that would allow us, even when our cause couldn't be more just, and even when those against us couldn't be more unjust, instead of reacting with hostility, to be able to embrace the other at deep cost to ourselves. We know that these allusions to prison and death threats ended with the death of his own, loss of his own life. That did end up happening. When you think about what this man did to change the conscience of a nation, I think the question it should raise for us is, what framework would we need to have to do that again today? What sociology would we need to really value the other, not just as a biological pile of atoms, but as a human made in the image of God? What anthropology would we need in the way that we see and think reflectively about the nuance of our own hearts? And what ontology, what basis of identity, the real framework in which we find ourselves, as embraced perhaps before we believed the right thing and before we behaved the right way, the kind of embracing that the Father does of the Son, and the kind of embracing I think the Christian faith offers through the message of the cross. Do we have a framework like that? I want to say, I do think that in the message of the gospel, I think that we can. So, thank you for giving me a hearing today. Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.